Let me tell you this. With our history, with all these things we are talking about, we are not afraid of anything.
Paul Kagame of Rwanda has made a bombshell revelation on how United States uses and exploits Africa. Stay tuned and make sure you don't miss this one. The Rwandan president is known for being direct, but this time he has gone further than ever, exposing how the USA, a global superpower, continues to exploit Africa. What exactly is Kagame saying? How deep does this exploitation go? And most importantly, how does it impact Africa's future? Paul Kagame is no stranger to controversy, but his recent statements about the USA's role in Africa have sparked an even bigger debate. Speaking at a forum, Kagame didn't hold back. He accused the USA of using Africa as a resource playground, exploiting its minerals, energy, and human capital, all while keeping the continent dependent on foreign aid and maintaining a skewed power balance. But how exactly is this exploitation happening? He highlights several areas: economic manipulation, control over African markets, and a cycle of dependency that benefits the West far more than it ever helps Africa.
We suffer from one fact that there is so much talk about sovereignty, but you find either we don't qualify to have these sovereign rights. Every other person across the world wants to decide either for Rwanda or decide for Africa. Somebody should find that associating with Africa is beneficial. And for example, Africa and the United States, if they worked together, it would benefit both Africa and the United States than when you have Africa dealing with individual countries or ignoring them altogether. But for small countries like Rwanda, it's very difficult if you look at Rwanda as a small country in isolation and not in the context of the continent. So it is difficult to maintain a predictable, consistent relationship as Rwanda and the United States. Because within the United States, I'll give you quickly an example affecting Rwanda already. You know, we used to be eligible to AGOA, African Growth Opportunity Act. And then when Rwanda wanted to grow its textile industries, and therefore reduced on the flow of used clothes into Rwanda, some lobbyists, people who are benefiting in the United States from this trade, and by the way, the used clothes, most of it would come from China. And they were selling it to Africa, and they have been doing that, and they were selling those clothes to Rwanda. And when we wanted to grow our industries, so the lobbyists who were benefiting from this used clothes trade actually influenced the powers that be in the United States to strike off AGOA Rwanda so that we came under punishment for just doing that, for wanting to grow economy. So you can see a small country trying to grow its economy, its industries, and has to deal with this situation, then there is a backlash, and we have suffered for that.
Kagame's argument? The USA keeps Africa poor on purpose, using it as a source of raw materials without allowing the continent to industrialize. This is the hidden truth. Let's talk about resources. Africa is rich, incredibly rich in resources. Yet why is it that many African countries remain economically disadvantaged? Kagame points to what he calls economic neo-colonialism. Western companies, primarily American, extract these resources at dirt-cheap prices, process them abroad, and sell them back to African nations at higher costs. It's a vicious cycle, leaving African economies stuck in a perpetual state of underdevelopment. To make matters worse, African countries often find themselves locked into trade agreements that favor Western nations. Many of these deals were set during or after the colonial era and have not changed much since. Whether it's in mining, agriculture, or technology, African economies remain tied to Western markets and regulations, making it nearly impossible to compete on a global scale. Another critical point Kagame makes is about aid. The USA is one of the biggest foreign aid donors to Africa, but Kagame argues that this aid is a double-edged sword. While it might seem generous on the surface, it creates a dependency trap. African nations are forced to rely on handouts rather than developing sustainable economies. In return, the West gains influence over domestic policies and governance. Think about it. Aid often comes with strings attached. Recipients are expected to adopt policies favorable to Western interests, whether that's aligning politically with the USA or opening their markets to Western corporations.
Of course, there are exemptions. In the past, we have seen PEPFAR that we benefited from greatly, and that's how Rwanda built its health systems. And even that helped us to actually deal with the current pandemic because we established those strong systems and we were using support from United States. So, but at the same time, United States also, and that affects Rwanda, is one of the two countries in the whole world that refused to use, say, the terminology that was agreed by everybody in the United Nations, referring to the tragic events that happened in our country as genocide against the Tutsis. And we have never understood why, because we even entered into arguments and said, well, if you are talking about Holocaust, you are talking about the Holocaust of the Jews. You are not talking about everybody who died during that period when the Jews were being killed under the Holocaust. So, but for some reasons which they have not even explained, they prefer to say, no, yeah, you know, some other people died. We went into arguments, but United States comes out, imagine powerful United States as it is, and is arguing on this non-issue that has been sorted out at the UN. We cannot understand what is behind it or who benefits from it. So this creates an atmosphere of unpredictability, and that's how it becomes difficult for Rwanda, therefore, to predict what is going to happen going forward in terms of relationship. We suffer from one fact that there is so much talk about sovereignty, but you find either we don't qualify to have these sovereign rights. Every other person across the world wants to decide either for Rwanda or decide for Africa. And therefore, the best thing is to let Africa and Rwanda be partners with developed countries, powerful countries, and Rwanda or Africa therefore decide on what we want for us, ourselves going forward. For example, and we are just reminded by this pandemic, when you find that countries are suffering because they do not have health systems built in a manner that will serve them when such a pandemic strikes, therefore that means we need to build our health systems. We need to look at climate change that affects us. We need to look at growing our industries. And the United States has a lot to offer in these areas to make Rwanda and Africa be able to stand on their own and strong as partners of the United States. So this is what we would ask any government, any administration of the United States, and I think it has been there for decades as we know it.
This is where Kagame calls for a fundamental shift. Africa must break free from this dependency and reclaim control over its economic future. Let's not forget the military aspect. Kagame has raised concerns about the growing number of U.S. military bases in Africa, particularly under the guise of counter-terrorism. The USA's AFRICOM, Africa Command, has expanded significantly in the last decade, with bases and missions all over the continent. But Kagame and many others argue that this military presence is less about securing African nations and more about securing American interests. Why? Because these military initiatives often coincide with areas rich in resources or regions where political instability threatens Western business interests. Kagame implies that these military bases aren't just for peacekeeping, they're also a way to exert control over African governments and their decision-making processes. So what's Kagame's solution? He's calling for a new Africa-first strategy, one where African nations can build strong, self-sustaining economies without relying on foreign powers. He's urging African leaders to rethink their trade relationships, reduce dependency on foreign aid, and invest in their own industries. And we're already seeing movements in this direction. From the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Kenya investing in local manufacturing and tech, there's a growing awareness that Africa's future cannot be built by outsiders. It's time for Africa to rise and take control of its destiny. Kagame's message is clear. Africa needs to break free from the historical chains of exploitation and take charge of its future. The question is, are African leaders ready to take the bold steps needed? And more importantly, is the global power structure ready for a strong, independent Africa? Thank you for watching. What do you think about Paul Kagame's claims? Is the USA exploiting Africa, or is there more to the story? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you in the next video where we continue exploring the geopolitics shaping our world. Stay informed and stay empowered.